You don't get criticized. You don't get warned. Nothing visibly goes wrong, but a meeting disappears from your calendar. An email thread you were part of suddenly continues without you. A decision is announced after it's already been settled. No one tells you that you're excluded. No one tells you that you're still included either. There's no confrontation, no explanation, no clear signal that something has changed. And because nothing explicit happens, it's hard to react. There's nothing to push back against, nothing to clarify, just silence. And the silence feels intentional, even though no one ever says anything. Exclusion at work doesn't always arrive as conflict. There's no meeting where someone tells you that your role is changing. No feedback explaining why your input is no longer needed. No disagreement that you can point to. Instead, things quietly move around you. You notice it in small, almost dismissible ways. You're informed instead of consulted. You hear about decisions after they're finalized. Your name drops off calendars without comment. And because nothing overtly negative is said, it's easy to doubt yourself. You tell yourself you might be overthinking it, that schedules change, that priorities shift, that this is probably temporary, that hesitation is part of why this works. Silence doesn't trigger alarm the way criticism does. There's no clear accusation to respond to, no explicit rejection to confront, which means exclusion can happen without resistance. Importantly, this isn't always personal. You might still be seen as competent, reliable, easy to work with. The shift isn't about punishment, it's about position. Your access changes before your title does. Your visibility narrows before your responsibilities are formally adjusted. And because no one announces this shift, you're left waiting for clarity that never arrives. You stay available, you stay cooperative. You assume that if you keep performing, things will reset on their own. But silence isn't neutral. It doesn't simply leave a gap. It creates one. And that gap quietly changes where you stand inside the system. Silence is an absence. It's a signal. And signals always serve someone. In most organizations, explanation creates responsibility. The moment someone explains a decision, they own it. They create a record. They invite questions, disagreement, or negotiation. Silence avoids all of that. When nothing is explained, nothing needs to be defended. There's no statement to contradict, no position to challenge. Decisions can move quietly without friction. From the system's perspective, this is efficient. Silence preserves flexibility. It allows priorities to shift without forcing justification. It keeps relationships intact on the surface, even as roles subtly change underneath. Conflict draws attention. Silence diffuses it. This is why quiet exclusion often appears during periods of transition, reorganizations, strategy changes, leadership realignments. Explaining every adjustment would slow the process. It would create resistance. It would force accountability before outcomes are clear. Silence postpones that cost. And just like ambiguity in projects, silence doesn't require malicious intent. Most people using silence don't think of it as a tactic. They think of it as practicality, as avoiding unnecessary tension, as keeping things moving. But the effect is structural. When someone is quietly excluded, their influence decreases without confrontation. Their ability to shape decisions fades without debate. And importantly, they no longer pose a risk to decisions already made. No argument, no disagreement, just alignment. Silence allows power to be redistributed without anyone having to say that redistribution is happening. And the quieter the change, the less resistance it creates. Meetings are rarely just about coordination. They are about access. Access to information before it hardens into decisions. Access to context before narratives settle. Access to influence before responsibility is assigned. When you are no longer in the room, something subtle changes. You don't lose your job. You don't lose your title. You lose timing. Decisions begin to reach you after they are shaped, not while they are forming. By the time you're informed, the logic is already aligned. Alternatives feel disruptive rather than constructive. And this is where exclusion does its real work. When you're absent from the conversation, you're no longer part of the trade-offs. You don't push back. You don't slow things down. You don't complicate consensus. From the system's perspective, this is cleaner. No disagreement, no visible resistance, just alignment. Importantly, exclusion doesn't remove responsibility right away. You may still be accountable for outcomes, still expected to deliver, still measured against results. You're just no longer involved in shaping the decisions that create those results. That separation matters. Because when outcomes are reviewed later, responsibility has somewhere to land. But influence has already moved on. This is why exclusion often precedes redefinition. Before roles are adjusted on paper, they're adjusted through access. Before authority is reassigned formally, it's redistributed informally. And because none of this is announced, it feels ambiguous rather than deliberate. That ambiguity is useful. It allows people to say nothing has changed, that you're still part of the team, that your role is still important, all of which can be true technically, but functionally your position has shifted. And this shift doesn't require conflict to be effective. It only requires silence to remain unchallenged. You're still responsible, you're just no longer involved. That's the quiet exchange taking place. And this only works as long as no one names what's happening. Silence rarely appears all at once. It tends to arrive in stages. The first sign is a change in how information reaches you. You're no longer part of early discussions. You're looped in after alignment has already happened. Agendas arrive late, or after decisions are effectively made. Nothing about this feels aggressive. It feels procedural. The second sign is how feedback behaves. It doesn't get worse. It disappears. You're not corrected. You're not coached. You're simply no longer part of the refinement process, which is often misread as a good sign. But feedback usually disappears before exclusion becomes official, not after. The third sign is language. You're told things like, "We'll keep you posted." This is already moving forward. You don't need to worry about this part. Each sentence sounds reassuring. Taken together, they describe distance. The fourth sign appears when you try to re-enter. You ask clarifying questions, you offer input, and the response is polite but closed. Decisions are framed as already settled. Constraints are emphasized. Options feel limited. You're present but not influential. And then there's repetition. The same pattern across different situations, different meetings, different decisions, the same quiet exclusion. None of these signals are definitive on their own. That's what makes them easy to rationalize. You tell yourself it's temporary, contextual, not worth reacting to. But patterns don't require intent to be meaningful. They only require consistency. And silence, when repeated, stops being neutral. Silence almost always appears before exclusion becomes official, which is why awareness matters. Not to trigger reaction, but to prevent misinterpretation. Because the risk isn't that you're being excluded. The risk is that you respond as if nothing has changed, when it already has. When silence shows up, the instinctive response is to chase clarity. You want to ask what changed. You want to confirm you're still involved. You want to fix the ambiguity before it hardens into something permanent. That instinct is understandable. It's also risky, because chasing inclusion too early often does the opposite of what you intend. It confirms that your position is already weaker than it was. It turns silence into a negotiation you didn't choose. The goal here isn't to force your way back into the room. It's to avoid mispositioning yourself while the structure is shifting. The first adjustment is internal. You stop treating silence as a personal problem to solve. You stop assuming the right move is to ask for reassurance. You recognize that silence is doing work, whether anyone names it or not. The second adjustment is behavioral. You remain visible where your authority actually exists. You continue to deliver within your defined scope. You don't volunteer to compensate for decisions you weren't part of. This isn't withdrawal, it's containment. You're not trying to regain access through effort or availability. You're preserving leverage by not overextending into spaces where influence has already moved. And the third adjustment is observational. You watch what happens next, not emotionally, structurally. Do decisions continue without you? Does responsibility remain, even as access narrows? Does silence persist once outcomes become clearer? These signals tell you more than any explanation would, because explanations can be managed. Silence reveals alignment. The goal isn't to get back into the room. The goal is to avoid confirming a position that hasn't been formally assigned to you yet. Sometimes silence resolves on its own, sometimes it doesn't. But reacting too quickly almost always locks the shift in place. And that's the mistake this response is designed to prevent. Silence at work is often misunderstood. It's seen as indecision, avoidance, or poor communication. But in many environments, silence is functional. It allows change without confrontation. It allows power to move without explanation. And it allows responsibility to remain flexible until outcomes are known. This doesn't mean silence is always exclusion, but it almost always signals repositioning. Access changes before roles do. Influence shifts before accountability is updated. And visibility narrows before anything becomes official. Once you understand that, the experience feels different. You stop trying to decode silence as feedback. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop reacting as if clarity will arrive if you ask the right question. Instead, you watch where decisions are made. You notice who is present before alignment happens. You observe how responsibility is distributed after outcomes appear. That's where position is revealed. Not in what's said, but in who's included when it matters. This doesn't require cynicism, and it doesn't require confrontation. It requires awareness. Knowing that silence isn't neutral. Knowing that it's doing work long before anyone names it. And knowing that how you respond during that quiet period matters more than what you say. Because when silence becomes the tool, visibility becomes the risk. And the people who move through that moment intact aren't the ones who demand answers the fastest. They're the ones who understand what the silence is actually doing.